Over the past few decades, GCC states have been able to leverage their considerable hydrocarbon wealth to develop their economies and increase their regional and global influence. But also over the past decade or so, they have been able to leverage another asset, their strategic location. So already sitting at the intersection of East and West, Europe and Asia, GCC states are well positioned to connect both regions. And already GCC states and also other states in the region have been part of the Belt and Road Initiative since it was launched in 2013, of course with varying degrees of involvement, and are also now slated to be part of the newer initiatives such as the IMEC, as well as the Iraq and Turkey Development Road. So, what are the impact of these corridors on GCC economies? And within the context of geopolitics and geoeconomics, how does BRI compete with IMEC? How does the unfolding genocide in Gaza impact the prospects of IMEC? And more broadly, what are the longer-term strategic implications of these corridors? So to discuss and unpack many of these questions, we have assembled for you a stellar panel of experts. To my left, Dr. Karen Young, Senior Research Scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen, Fellow of Middle East and Co-Director of Middle East Energy Roundtable at Rice University. And third, Dr. Chuchu Zhang, Associate Professor at the School of International Relations and Public Affairs and Deputy Director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University in China. Of course, Dr. Chuchu was supposed to be with us today, but she fell victim to great power competition dynamics, and her visa was not issued in time in Beijing, but she is joining us from Shanghai today, and it's 12 hours ahead, so I appreciate you being up at 3:20 a.m. in the morning. And last but not least, of course, Dr. Gawdat Bahgat, Professor of National Security Affairs at the National Defense University Near East and South Asia Center for Strategic Studies and Senior Non-Resident Fellow at GIF. Thank you all. So we'll follow the same format. We'll also have 2 questions, and then we'll open for discussion. So, Karen, it would be great to start with you. And your research really looks at these national visions in the Gulf, very ambitious. And we want to really understand how do these corridors fit into these national visions and the development of GCC states' economies. So, the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you all for coming into the freezing room. So it's funny. I've been really critical about IMEC and these what I see very much as political proposals of integration rather than on their economic merit. And that's okay. It's fine to have ideas about connectivity and integration, but I think they have to come with some measure and sort of recalibration of the expectations of what this does for regional trade integration or collective growth. And so just like the vision plans which we see across the GCC states, they're very much developmentalist state models based on the idea that infrastructure is a boost to growth. And the vision plans really came first, and these ideas, IMEC, the PGI, these are new, or newer. So the question is really better, how do the more recent sort of political ideas of integration in the region fit into the existing infrastructure and development plans of the vision projects? There's certainly a lot of alignment. There's a lot of alignment in the idea of ports and the idea of physical infrastructure to share electricity transmission, the goals of pipelines either through for gas export from the Eastern Med, or for the potential of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen export from the region. But those are a lot of ifs. And the thing about creating this kind of infrastructure, whether it's on land through rail, the sea routes obviously just exist, or the things that will go in cables and pipelines, which are kind of more interesting, is that they don't just benefit a few, right? This will be infrastructure that can benefit many. And so the whole idea that it's in counter or in competition with the BRI doesn't really hold, because China too can benefit from these projects. And so goods that come from China into the Khalifa port in Abu Dhabi, or into Salalah in Oman, or even up the Red Sea, can still travel the same direction. So it's very much an imaginary kind of thing, and it's not something that can be possessed or constrained. That said, if you do build cables, like the fiber cables, that really matters. That's really important, because those can be owned by private and public-private partnerships. And that is where I see a mechanism of competition where at least IMEC has a little bit more ground, and certainly falls in line with Gulf Vision expectations of diversification, where you're not shipping containers of crude, you're basically transporting data. And this is very much a future vision that we're seeing coming into reality in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, and the ability to have enough electricity generation to have these massive data centers, which can then be these conduits for information and processing that would go from east to west. So anyway, I could talk a whole lot more, but that's probably where I should stop. Yes, they can be aligned, but there's going to be certainly redundancy, just as we've seen in these vision projects before. And there's going to be not equal benefits to all, and unintended beneficiaries, which, if it's in a geopolitical context, I think is a little bit underappreciated.
Great, thank you. So just to follow up just quickly on that, so the IMEC is also almost the reincarnation, recalibration of Build Back Better World announced by Biden. So do you think it really has legs? Because some people think it doesn't really have legs in the long term.
Well, right now, in terms of a negotiation, it is stalled. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. And so this is, this was announced after the G7 meeting, and then we had October 7th, and so it is certainly lost momentum. The other political factor or geopolitical factor is the bet it makes on India, mm-hmm. which is a U.S. foreign policy objective. That is a gamble. That is not a guarantee. So, for example, India's global value add in terms of manufacturing is about 2.9%. Germany's is 5.1%. China's is over 30%. So if you're really thinking about competing with China and thinking that India is going to be the manufacturing and kind of trade hub of the world, that's crazy.
Okay, great. So a bet on India, very, very interesting.
It's a crazy bet on India.
Okay. So maybe we can now unpack a bit on the geopolitical context that you alluded to, and I'll ask Kristian. Of course, now we've been in the war on the genocide in Gaza, more than 40,000 dead, 20,000 so children, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and it really has changed the region. And of course, it has an impact on IMEC. So perhaps can you expand on the potential impact of the Gaza genocide on the IMEC project?
I mean, I agree with Karen, her points about IMEC, and it's a political, it's almost like a historical artifact. It's an artifact that should be in a museum for the ways in which governments were thinking in the immediate run-up to October 7th. Mm-hmm. It was announced 3 weeks before October 7th. It was announced at a G7 or G20, G20 in New Delhi. That Biden was at, and MBZ was there, and I think MBS was there. And again, it struck me as ambitious at the time, which events over the last 12 months have made even more so, perhaps unfeasible now. I mean, on the one hand, the after effects of the war in Gaza have actually strengthened the case for an alternative supply route, because something that could bypass the Red Sea mm-hmm. with the Houthi attacks looks very attractive right now. But of course, it can't be IMEC with the current situation on land. So I think they're stuck. The war in Gaza has clearly made the prospect of peace that would facilitate that interconnectivity more difficult. I think inbuilt into IMEC was a hope that Saudi Arabia would obviously come to some form of normalization with Israel. It wasn't just the UAE and Israel. It was the Saudis in the middle. That, I think, also is now probably a lot further away. So some of the assumptions that were inbuilt into IMEC have clearly been tested to the point of almost destruction. Certainly, I think we also see the thinking in IMEC to try to look at this in terms of a kind of great power competition as, again, being really damaged by the events over the last 12 months. I mean, it always struck me as fanciful that, for example, Haifa in Israel, you have a heavy Chinese presence there. Piraeus in Athens is run by Costco. So, you always had glaring contradictions at some of the components of IMEC. So, again, I just think over the last 12 months, the situation in the region has moved on so far, so fast, that these plans, which were predicated on the Abraham Accord assumption of an economic benefit from peace, however you define it, I've just got to be revisited right now, because there's clearly going to be a very different form of peace going forward, if there is, than the one that was maybe imagined even 2-3 days before October 7th, when the editor-in-chief of Arab News wrote an op-ed in Arab News laying out the Saudi vision for a Palestinian component to normalization, which was effectively closer economic integration. But again, the price for that from the Saudi side, but then of course the physical catastrophe that has overtaken the Palestinian territories makes almost that, even by itself, almost a non-event right now. I mean, there are clearly other things that are far more important, like reconstruction and just stopping the catastrophe, full stop.
Stopping the catastrophe. That's exactly what we're talking about. Maybe perhaps under Trump administration, to resuscitate Abraham Accords 2.0 will have an impact on such a return of the IMEC idea?
I mean, it might be more transactional, and I liked one of the speakers earlier who said that Trump might be attracted by doing something that Biden tried to do but couldn't. I mean, I think that would certainly appeal to Trump's character. But, I mean, if you look at Jared Kushner, for example, and regardless of if he goes in or doesn't go into any administration, I mean, look at his plans for, beachfront property developments in Gaza. I suspect that, that's just... There'll be other interests at play, which will certainly not be good ones for the Palestinians.
Well, we'll find out soon. And I think, leading us to the third question to Chuchu, I know, of course, the BRI has had a 10-year head time in its projects in the region. It has a key advantage of BRI versus the IMEC is that China can approach its connectivity project in a bilateral fashion, while the IMEC has this multiple countries that need to agree on logistics, funding, and finance.
How does China perceive the progress of the Belt and Road Initiative and the development of economic corridors across the Gulf region? Well, thanks for having me. First, I believe that the progress of the Belt and Road Initiative and the development of economic corridors across the Gulf states are driven by real demand rather than artificial design. So prosperity of the corridors doesn't come from deliberate planning alone, it emerges from genuine needs. So, for instance, let's take the ancient Silk Road, for example. It existed for thousands of years, but it wasn't something China sat down and mapped out. Instead, it was naturally formed by the interests of different people, like Europeans, Middle Eastern people, and Chinese alike. So it wasn't until the 19th century that the geographers even gave it the name of the Silk Road. However, in the age of the Great Discovery, as trade demands between the Eurasian countries shifted, the Silk Road eventually declined. And today I would say that with the rapid growth of developing economies, there is a renewed demand for trade and efficient, low-cost transportation. And this is the context in which initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and various economic corridors proposed by different states have emerged. So we can think of them as part of a new modern Silk Road. And we must remember that the Belt and Road was never owned by China. Even the Silk Road was not owned by China or any one state. Actually, the Silk Road was co-constructed and shared by all the actors who benefit from it, and today the new Silk Road is the same. Secondly, we often hear about the trend of anti-globalization in the world today, but actually the proposal of these economic corridors, I would say, tell a different story, which is one of the continued demand for globalization. For example, countries such as those in Europe, the Middle East, in China, and India, despite having very different economic structures, they all depend on open global economic system, which calls for the emergence of various types of economic corridors to support it. And lastly, it is very clear that regional actors in the Middle East today, they are some of the biggest beneficiaries. Because if you look at a map, you will notice that the Middle East was the heart and hub of the ancient Silk Road. And today, with projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which is the IMEC, and also the Development Road, so all the region's geopolitical importance is once again being elevated. So with the growing strength of regional powers, these countries now have the ability to not only lead their own corridor projects, but also align their initiatives with projects of the other major powers. One example, the strategic synergy between Turkey's Middle Corridor and the Belt and Road, which is often considered by China as a successful story of strategic synergy between Beijing and the Middle East. Meanwhile, today, regional actors have more chances to hedge between different global initiatives, maintaining flexibility and influence in shaping the future of the global trade. So in other words, regional actors, they try to make use of the other projects to satisfy their own interests. And if you ask me about China's perceptions of the IMEC in particular, I would say that first of all, I would say the IMEC still faces lots of challenges. For instance, in the context of the ongoing Gaza war, any project connecting Jordan with Israel will face very strong opposition from the Jordanian public. And the second issue is that the IMEC itself, especially the connection between Indian ports and the Emirati ports, has great technical difficulty, and also it needs a huge amount of investment. So who is going to do the construction work? And that is a big issue. And also who is going to fund for everything? The United States is not interested in funding the project. India does not have the financial capacity, so they all expect that the Gulf powers are going to finance it. But the tricky part is that right now Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, they are all occupied by their visions, such as Saudi Vision 2030. So they are not prepared to fund for everything or either. So the thing is, China is good at constructing, and also China can provide part of the funding. So China thinks that maybe itself can even become part of it if it is allowed. And third, the Middle East is not facing an overabundance of infrastructure and there is competition. It's not like that, but the problem is that today the Middle East is facing insufficient infrastructure. So it means that, okay, China is there and the United States is there. They have different projects for infrastructure, and that is great. That is going to make contribution to solve the regional difficulty of infrastructure deficit. And last but not least, China's foreign policy is not based on the alliance system, and China does not want to side with certain countries and exclude the others. So China wants to deal with everybody. And today it expects that regional actors, they have the same preference, that is to diversify their partners. So when people ask, what does China think if the Middle Eastern countries, they look east for economic cooperation, but they look west for military cooperation, I would say that China is very comfortable with it. Also, it knows clearly that looking east does not simply mean looking towards China, but also it looks towards Japan, South Korea, and India, etc. And China knows that, driven by the desire to include more partners, the regional powers will not kick China out, even if they collaborate with other powers on grand projects. So in general, China is not worried about this kind of competition, and it doesn't perceive it as a zero-sum game. Does China view these emerging corridors as competitors to its broader economic ambitions in the region, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, my argument is that China does not view these emerging economic corridors as competitors. In fact, the rise of diverse corridors in the region aligns with China's own interests. Above all, if we examine the Belt and Road Initiative, something very interesting is that you can notice it's often seen as somewhat vague and abstract project, because there isn't even an official map that clearly defines the routes of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I would describe the Belt and Road Initiative as a flexible initiative, one that calls for greater connectivity and aims to address the infrastructure deficit in the global south. So the goal is not for China to dominate, organize, and fund every project, and China does not have the capacity to fund every project. Instead, under the Belt and Road framework, China seeks to attract other countries, including the Gulf states, to collaborate on projects in the third-party countries, such as Pakistan or the African countries. So even with the emergence of other economic corridors, such as the Development Road, which aren't directly part of the Belt and Road Initiative, it doesn't mean China cannot play a role. For example, there is potential for some of the Chinese enterprises to participate in financing or taking on construction work, even if the corridor is not under the Belt and Road Initiative. It means that the Chinese enterprises may still do business with the local residents in their projects, for instance. And second, even if China isn't directly involved in these corridors, that doesn't mean it won't benefit from it. Actually, some commentators see India's active participation in the IMEC as an effort to exclude China from the region, but in reality, that is going to be very difficult because economic corridors and infrastructure projects, they are by nature public goods. So it's there and everybody can use it. And also, China already has investment in India, and it has industrial parks and Chinese enterprises there. So even for projects like IMEC, there are indirect ways China could still benefit. And third, if we look closely, China and India share some interesting similarities in the approach to the Middle East. And despite the competition, both countries play a strong emphasis on regional connectivity, and this shared focus on linkage, on linking regions and strengthening infrastructure means that even in competition, there are areas where their interests can align with each other. And some Chinese scholars, they also argue that the Belt and Road Initiative stimulated the region's imagination of interconnection. So as a result, infrastructure projects under different labels have become very active. If no one thinks this is important and only China is paying attention to issues like connectivity and infrastructure, then Belt and Road Initiative is a failure, I would say. But if everybody is interested in the topic, but not necessarily talking about these topics under the Belt and Road framework, I think that does not matter. And fourth, as one of the world's largest oil importers, China has a vested interest in maintaining balanced relations with all parties in the region and doing business with everyone. So, for instance, stability, peace, and steady oil prices, they are essential to China's economic interests. And the emergence of regional economic corridors, whether they are part of the Belt and Road Initiative or not, they create opportunities for regional powers to identify common interests and promote greater integration. So this in turn creates a more stable environment that benefits China and allows China to maintain partnership with different regional actors.
Great. Thank you. So Professor Gawdat, a lot of these we're discussing IMEC and the BRI, but also there are regionally grown initiatives such as the recently announced, of course, Turkey, Iraq Development Road. So I wanted to ask you, how does this project fit in within IMEC or BRI, complement or conflict with, please?
Thank you. And I have kind of mixed feeling about it. First, I believe important takeaway is geoeconomy has replaced geopolicy to some degree. it is positive development is that all countries are interested in promoting trade, investment, economic well-being. Generation ago, it was Arab nationalism vis-a-vis Islamism and other policy. So it's great that all countries are paying more attention to their economies and fighting over ideology. And during the day, we heard a lot about different visions, Saudi, Qatari, Omani, Vision 2030, 2040, and so on. So I believe it is positive development that there is interest in building trade routes. Second point I want to make, it is not a zero-sum game. It is not one corridor replaces another. We are in the United States free market. I believe it is a good idea, great that there are different options. And as you know, also it is not only Turkey, Iraq, but Iran, Russia, there is north-south corridor. So there are different proposals. And one main point about it, you cannot exclude any player. I mean, the corridor, Turkey, Iraq, Turkey's major economic, political, military power, north-south, Iran is another major regional power. This corridor between India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, Europe, all of them are major global powers. At the end of the day, and I believe this is probably my main takeaway from the whole day today, at the end of the day, in the Middle East, there are four peoples: Arabs, Turks, Iranians, and Israelis. They have always lived side by side, and they will always be neighbors. And somehow we have to stop thinking about the zero-sum game and eliminating any group, any people. I believe it's better to find a way for the four peoples to acknowledge each other and to accept each other. One final point I'm glad Dr. Yang mentioned data, and long time ago somebody said data is the new oil, and it is great that not only trade in goods but moving or transferring data cables, this is will be very positive.
Great. Thank you, Professor. Karen, actually, as part of the project in a previous institution, I believe tracked Chinese investment in the region and a component of the BRI. So maybe perhaps reflect on the BRI, especially if it's 10 years ahead of IMEC. But of course, as you mentioned, it's focused more on oil infrastructure in Saudi, for example, which has the lion's share in the Gulf, but also in other areas like the Duqm port in Oman. So perhaps just a reflection on the BRI.
Sure.
To save the day.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm very sorry that we can't hear our colleague. I mean, I think some of the trend lines in Chinese interest in investment in the Gulf have certainly changed over 10, 15 years. And so what used to be mainly contracting and not really much of a presence and not an important investor so much in the Gulf is now changing. We're seeing more and more co-investments, particularly from Gulf national oil companies and actually in China, as well as the reverse of Chinese investment inside the Gulf in refineries and in different petrochemical facilities and even in pipelines. What we're also seeing now is a real concerted effort to bring in Chinese expertise and investment into renewable energy. And so, for example, China's Silk Road Fund is a 50% investor into part of the company that is Aqua Power, which is also happened by the Saudi Public Investment Fund. And there are 3 Chinese solar wafer and panel manufacturing companies which are now creating manufacturing sites inside of the kingdom. That's new. We didn't really see that, what we call greenfield investment from China in the Gulf before, where you have a physical presence and, you know, like a factory on the ground. And so we are beginning to see that. In ports, yes, there has been, of course, investment and in the Khalifa port, Chinese investment and interest in Duqm, and that is all in the last few years. And that, of course, makes the United States a little bit nervous. But generally, these are, you know, certainly related to the traditional oil and gas industries, renewable industries, and traditional trade. And the Gulf states, all of them, see China definitely as an important economic partner. And the way that China then associates or gives kind of status to the Gulf states in its strategic partnership nomenclature is like kind of like a brownie badge, right? You get to wear it, and that's great. It doesn't really mean anything, but we do see that as kind of gaining importance. And I think for the Gulf, there's no problem with also having a very strong relationship with India in the same way. So the way that competition is viewed from the Arabian Peninsula between these actors is very, very different than how it's viewed perhaps by those actors themselves.
And I think also the approach to India, we have countries like the UAE deepening its ties with India. So again, the approach between the GCC countries is also not unified yet. Which leads us to the other question, Kristian. I mean, can you reflect on these projects within the context of great power competition and how the GCC foreign policy, like we heard a lot today about balancing and hedging and using the China card and so on. So how does this impact on the geopolitics?
I think the renewable energy is very interesting because it seems as if that is one area where perhaps there's less of a geopolitical dimension, at least in terms of US concern about China investments in the Gulf, which I think is welcome because, as Gawdat said, it's not a zero-sum game, although increasingly there are a lot of people who look at it as a zero-sum game, and then one is reminded of the enormous pressure that was put on the UAE when the Chinese investment in Khalifa Port. I mean, you had the Wall Street Journal suggestions that there was some sort of military or naval component to it, and a lot of US pressure was put on the UAE as a result. We also have had, I think, a lot of US pressure put on the Saudis not to accept the offer to join BRICS or BRICS Plus. And I think we saw that Mohammed bin Salman did not go or will not go to the summit in Russia, and I think it's a moot point whether the Saudis will ever join. And from what I've certainly been hearing, that's not by accident. That's a result of a lot of US pressure as part of negotiations for a defense treaty between the US and Saudi Arabia, which would be part of any potential deal that the Biden administration had been hoping to make with Saudi Arabia, which of course requires normalization with Israel to get Senate support to facilitate or ensure ratification. So I think and I think someone this morning said the same thing. I think the administration is just looking at the regional issues through the wrong prism. They're looking at the regional issues through the prism of a great power competition and the Chinese, or maybe the Russian, but mostly the Chinese angle, and then trying to almost fit the facts accordingly. And my concern is that that has no bearing to conditions on the ground or interests, and the sort of notion that you can somehow cut China out of the Gulf completely, I think is completely fanciful. And I think anyone in the Gulf would be completely well advised to just project their interests where they can and not I guess to hedge to some extent, but not to obviously go all in one direction with the US if they're being told. And so I look at the way the administration is approaching, and okay, sure, you can have maybe negotiations in private not to join BRICS, or there's another concern about the de-dollarization, I guess, as well, which has also come up in some of the negotiations. But I think they're looking at it through this kind of great power lens, which doesn't help practical, kind of results-orientated objectives, which would actually have a realistic prospect of being implementable.
Do you think also with the election and change of administration, like China hawks versus China accommodationist in DC, like which way would it go?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, certainly with China, we've seen more continuity over the last 2 administrations than perhaps not, and that implies that regardless of who wins, whether it's Harris or Trump, you know, the sort of entrenched assumptions in DC are so deep now that they'll be hawkish regardless of which party wins. But what I think we're seeing in the Gulf is we're seeing Gulf states now increasingly reacting to the events of the past year and saying, well, we're going to, if you know, we see the US becoming less predictable, less, well, not reliable, but certainly less predictable. We're going to put our interests first, and we've seen that. We saw that with Saudi and Iran announcing their deal to restore relations and get the Chinese to effectively underwrite it. We saw that with Mohammed Salman last week receiving the Iranian foreign minister at the same time as the Biden administration was tying itself up in knots over the degree to which they should continue to basically give their unconditional support for Israel as they invade Lebanon. So, I mean, we're increasingly seeing some of the Gulf states effectively putting their interests first, regardless of whether that leaves the US. And that includes with China, I think.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So before I go to Professor Gawdat, after Professor Gawdat speaks, we'll go to the room. This is a more intimate setting than the other room, so you just raise your hand, identify yourself, have an impact, have a comment or a question. But before we go to the floor, Professor Gawdat, perhaps you can also expand on this strategic implication of the IMEC and this geostrategic competition between China and the US.
Before talking about this, I want to follow up on what Kristian said about the election and China, because during the day we heard a lot about the election and the impact of the election on Middle East. I'm working on an article now on this topic, and I believe at the end of the day, United States policy will not change much regardless of who wins the election. At the end of the day, Israel is the closest ally. At the end of the day, Iran has been US main adversary since the revolution, 1979. So at the end of the day, US is main arms supplier to the Middle East. So the fundamentals will not change. But for the strategic implication of IMEC, I believe it's important to look at the corridor based on its economic merit. But to a great extent, one main reason it has been proposed is policy, basically to promote normalization between Gulf states and Israel, that it will pass through Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Israel, and then Europe, and to some extent to isolate or not include 2 other major regional powers, Iran and Turkey. And I believe this will not work. Normalization now is almost dead. And again, as some speakers mentioned today, it will take at least a generation to get back for Arabs and Israelis to accept each other. One part of the corridor is to isolate China. And there is no way to isolate China. China is the main oil importer from the Gulf. And not only oil, but all Gulf states are trying to transition to renewable energy. China's main source for solar panels. So I believe if the corridor can survive on its own economic merits, it has chance to work. But there is so much policy there. And during the day, again, we talked a lot about the war in Gaza. I mean, one main takeaway I have taken from the whole day, US perception is at one of the lowest points it ever has been. And the notion global south is gaining more support, and there is more acceptance of China, Russia, and so on. So this will impact the corridor and any economic plan.
Good. Thank you, Professor. I think my colleague Yasmina at the Arab Barometer does lots of work on the perception of the U.S. Since the war specifically, and I think the data shows, of course, numbers going down for the U.S. and then China is able to leverage in terms of its public diplomacy and perception across the region. Okay, so now let's go to our audience and see if we have questions, comments, interjections. We have Professor Rory. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, both of you, Dr. Karen and Dr. Gawdat, you mentioned the data centers. I'm working on it in the context of smaller countries outside of the Gulf. It's been a long-term project with significant regulatory and other requirements to make these viable sectors. I'm just curious, what would you say are the main obstacles in the Gulf to be serious players in data economy in the next 5 to 10 years?
Data security. That's the key issue right now. It's not a problem of money. It's not a problem of interest. Not a problem of electricity generation. And that's why Sheikh Mohammed was here, 2-3 weeks ago, to try to get an agreement with the United States, which is being drafted. Yeah.
I would add there is all Gulf states are trying to invest in human capital, but it will take some time. I believe Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE are doing a great job in inviting the top universities from all over the world, but this does not happen overnight. So in terms of having the experts in cyber and AI, again, they are doing great, but it is a process. It will take some time. So this is another challenge.
Kristian, you want to reflect on that question? Or?
I don't work on this, but maybe from a geopolitical point, it's interesting if the Gulf states can become or can make themselves central to what is clearly going to be a critical node of the 21st century geo-economic or geopolitical order. I mean, that can be a way to obviously be almost like politics of protection. Kind of, you have the oil and gas reserves for now, but if in the future you are critical to data, then if anything happens to any of the Gulf states, you'll probably have people willing to support and protect you, if anything. Like we saw at Kuwait in 1990, and my mind there thinks of Oman. Oman has become so critical to the UK in terms of data collection, intelligence, that sort of thing, that that explains a lot of why Oman is always the only Gulf country which really figures in UK national security analyses. And so from a small state's point of view, if you're looking for that kind of external security layer, I think becoming an integral cog in a sort of much wider geo-economic machine is probably a good idea.
Thank you. Yasmina?
Security impact? The first problem is a commercial problem, right? And that's why none of these projects have, the only final investment decision has been in Saudi Arabia, and we still don't have product getting to market. So, the security issue, it's highly combustible, it's very difficult to transport, it's very expensive, you can't use the same pipelines that you use for natural gas. So there's that issue, yes, it's difficult to deal with. Do you make yourself as a producer more of a target in an instance like this moment where oil facilities and gas facilities are potentially going to be sites of attack? Yeah, I suppose so. It's critical infrastructure. It would be pretty much the same and be protected in the same way. but who would your customer be and be interested in helping you protect it? And so the whole kind of market momentum is this idea that Europe would be the key consumer of Gulf blue and green hydrogen, mostly green, and Japan. So that is different than the way that things are right now, because Europe is not a really big consumer of energy products from the Gulf. So would that change in EU? And there is a ministerial right this minute, I think, an EU GCC ministerial. Is that something they're talking about? Maybe, I don't know.
Any panel want to reflect on the blue hydrogen question? No. Very good. Omar, on a question in the back. Omar, go ahead first.
I have sort of a half-baked question, so please forgive me.
Okay.
Half-baked in that. Dr. Young, you started off talking about political proposal or political initiative without economic merit, described IMEC. And that makes total sense for us. It's useful as a rhetorical question, as a narrative question, but is it going to go anywhere? Probably not. There's some connectivity running through China and BRI. But, I mean, is there any hope? I mean, I'm old enough to remember talking with high-speed rail at the UCC that's gone nowhere. That's not a lack of money or initiative. But, for whatever reason, they came off the ground. Is there any hope for real connectivity projects that are driven from the region themselves?
So IMEC is both land and sea, right? So one component is a rail connection through the Arabian Peninsula, through Saudi Arabia. And Saudi has been sort of slow to work on the GCC rail. It's made more progress in between Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and maybe we'll see a bit going into Oman. Yes, it's been talked about, not really happened. The question is, like, who else could benefit from that? Does Jordan benefit? You know, does potentially could, you know, what would, I mean, it doesn't go through Iraq, but if we had connectivity and offshoots, could it? Yeah, maybe, but the thing is that the value of sea trade still through the Red Sea over any potential land trade, the sea trade is always going to be higher volume, easier, cheaper, particularly for hydrocarbons, but pretty much everything else. It just doesn't make sense to, you know, bring things from India or China, put them onto a rail in Oman or in Abu Dhabi, and then, you know, chug.
Many people say the opposite, though.
No, because you've got the labor cost, the pick it up, move it cost.
Back ownership.
Yes, and dealing with, I mean, to Yasmina's point, if you're dealing with hydrocarbons or hydrogen, like, not easy, right? Really expensive, but people flow, yeah, that'd be great. I mean, the basic stuff that high-speed rail does, super. But don't think of it as, I think, really monumental in terms of changing the price or the volume of trade flows. Plus, these states across the Middle East, but particularly the Arabian Peninsula into the Eastern Mediterranean, they don't make widgets that sell and trade. They transmit goods that are made in China and send them to other places. So again, who benefits? It's still going to be Chinese manufacturing.
Kristian, I know you wrote about the connectivity in the GCC. Are you optimistic about inter-GCC connectivity? I mean, the railroad project, I think, was resurrected recently, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're moving ahead at different speeds, perhaps. I mean, I think we see with the electricity grids, you know, the GCC Interconnection Authority. I mean, that's the main one, perhaps. And that's just recently, I think, expanded to include Iraq.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is maybe the area where you can see a sort of technocratic nuts and bolts cooperation, which is realistic, and actually probably will really deliver more good than some of the more fanciful schemes like IMEC, which, as Karen said, I mean, taking things off a ship, putting it back on a ship, often on again, with all the disruption that will cause, when again, the volume that you can put on a container ship is just so much higher. So things like the Interconnection Authority, if they can include Iraq and potentially even one day maybe link up with Iran, I mean, that might make a difference.
And before I go to the questions from the floor, I mean, this discussion led me, of course, to ask Professor Gawdat, from one Egyptian-born analyst to another, the potential impact on the Suez Canal, you know, because we spoke really about how it's easier from the Red Sea because we put container and straight through. But then again, in Egypt, there's a view that the IMEC will potentially have an impact on the Suez Canal. So perhaps, how does the Suez Canal fit within that framework of IMEC and BRI?
Egypt is not happy about it, and Egypt sees that this is a challenge, and usually when these things happen, Egyptian officials go on TV and say Suez Canal is the cheapest, the easiest, and we are not worried, but this means they are worried, and this is the case because, but I mean, I still believe having options is not bad, but the geopolitical developments in the region, including these proposed corridors, the war in Gaza, have been mixed blessing for Egypt. There are challenges. Egypt is, I don't want to say happy that Hamas has been destroyed, but President al-Sisi sees Muslim Brotherhood as enemy, and there is connection between Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, so there is some advantage. Another advantage, Egypt is the main mediator, so this is how U.S. foreign aid to Egypt is safe, because Egypt is main major player in mediating between Israel and Hamas, but probably the main disadvantage is that because of attacks in the Red Sea, Suez Canal is not making enough money or not making as much money as it used to be.
Great, thank you, Professor. Please.
Jesse, for this, I guess my question could also fall into this half-baked category, but I'm interested in sort of the language we're using to describe October 7th's impact on some of these trade corridors you mentioned, or some of the broader economic arrangements like the Abraham Accords. I guess in general, my question is, are we sort of overestimating people's memory of how much this will impact their attitudes after an eventual ceasefire? And if we're underestimating how easy it is to just quickly restart a lot of these talks that were pre-October 7th that might have stalled a little bit, and maybe we're even overestimating their impact on how it's actually played out now. I mean, as I see it, the Abraham Accord and its maybe economic and defense-related goals kind of continue full steam ahead between the UAE and Israel, and this idea that October 7th really fundamentally changed things. I mean, is that something that's actually happening in practice on the ground?
Yeah, great question. I think the short question is, how fast can we go back to business? Okay. Can we go back to business? I mean, it's opinion-based. Some people say this is a game changer. Some people say we're going to go back to business eventually. Karen.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your premise. I mean, the accords hold, and the trade and investment flows have continued between the UAE and Israel. But most of the investment was state investment anyway. So the idea of, popular sentiment really changing people's minds about making a business decision, it was a leadership decision, and that's what continues to drive the flows. I do also think, and I think Mohammed Bahroun, he was here a second ago, he just walked out. In the previous panel, he was sort of emphasizing that we need to take sort of a broader and global approach, both in terms of resolving, but also in seeing, I think from the Gulf perspective, that you don't change who your neighbors are. And so the whole orientation towards a focus on national economic development, that will continue to be Gulf states' focus, right? They're all going to be after that. And that necessitates relationships that are difficult. And I think that explains actually the willingness in many cases to have more of an open door policy with Iran. It's not that they trust Iran or think that Iran has, is going to be a great, even a great investment partner. It won't be, but you just kind of have to deal with what you have. So yes, I think there will be a level of practicality, and that there are lots of good reasons, and some people will be, mostly Palestinian people, will be very disappointed perhaps with the momentum that might come after. I mean, the whole, like, talk about Haifa Port and East Med Gas, and, you know, that is a strategic objective of the UAE, to have access to gas resources and to be in that business and to have access to, you know, the operator of the Haifa Port is the Adani Group, which is an Indian firm, which is mostly now owned by sovereign funds of the UAE. Like, those are strategic investments which are going to last for years and years, and the sentiment around the war and the tragedy, that's not going to go away, but it's also not going to change, you know, where some of these countries see their security and their lifeline.
Thank you. Chris, please go ahead with that perspective.
The question if October 7th is a game changer, I believe it shows that normalization has been top down. It is very much between elites, not people to people. What I know by statistics, much more Israelis have visited UAE and Bahrain than the other way around. It is one way. And this shows that Arab people have not accepted the Israelis. And with the war in Gaza, this made it much harder. I mean, probably to be fair to Israel, the balance of power is significantly in favor of Israel. And this is why Israeli leaders, especially in election season in the United States, do not see any restraint on their action. If my brother, my sister, my dad have been killed, I will not forgive the countries, the people who killed them. So I believe probably October 7th, it will take at least one generation for people to go back to pre-October 7th.
I think also, maybe I'll just jump in as well. I think there's the other changes, like the erosion of norms, you know, the reaction that we've seen towards Ukraine and Russia, and then the reaction towards the Gaza war, and discourse on the international norms, international system. I think that's an impact that's going to be long term. You know, countries in the region can recalibrate things, but if we say the global south and so on, people just view a bit what they perceive as the hypocrisy of the comparison between the two wars. But Kristian,
if I may just add one point here, because I work for the United States government, and whenever I try to say something good about U.S. foreign policy and say United States believes in law-based global order, people laugh at me now, because the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, many people see double standard, and it makes sense.
Yeah. So last but not least, Kristian, the back to business or game changer, October 7th as a game changer?
I mean, I was struck by 2023, in the months before October 7th, listening to US officials who were talking about the deal they were putting together between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And it was almost striking how the Palestinian component was almost something that they were trying to package up in a way that it wasn't central, it was just an element of a wider deal. And I think the question was, could you ever align what the Israelis are willing to concede with what the Saudis are willing to accept? And the Palestinian dimension didn't really come into it. It was a balance between Saudi Arabia and Israel and trying to find that balance. And I think that finding that balance has become a lot more challenging since October 7th. Now, whether to be an end to the war, I mean, we'd also have a new administration in the US, and certainly if it were, I mean, I think the Saudi leadership would be willing to entertain making a deal if they thought they could make enough gain from a deal, especially vis-a-vis the US. And I think they would do so if the opportunity came. Now, from Mohammed bin Salman's point of view, he can only play that card once. So I think he'd had to be absolutely certain that whatever gains he could make would overcome or any potential backlash from social groups at home, because, I mean, one of the things I've been struck by over the past year is just how angry, you know, the people are, just over, again, the double standards, and just, you see some of these statements, that people are just absolutely horrified by what's happened, and so I don't think people will forget. But at the same time, I think if there was a deal on offer that was acceptable to the leadership, which goes to your point about it being top down, then they might accept it, because, well, it'll be a new administration. And initially what was striking in 2023 was how the Biden administration was trying to ensure that they got a deal by March 2024, the latest, to allow time for ratification before they got kind of mixed up with the election, but in the hope that that would give them a major foreign policy success before, well, during Biden's first term when he was thinking about running for re-election. So there were so many multiple overlapping sets of interests that finding that balance, which is already hard enough before October 7th last year, might be even more difficult after what's happened over the last 12 months.
Great. Thank you, Kristian. Any final questions from the room? Because we lost a speaker, we can finish 10 minutes earlier. So if there's no questions, I want to thank our speakers, not only for their expertise, but for braving the coldest conference room I've ever been in. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.